Well, the background is that after the publication of the 2 volumes of Nazi Germany and the Jews, there were comments and some really pointed remarks over the years, mainly after the publication of the Years of Extermination. And essentially, what I will do here today is explaining some of the concepts, explaining the background, and also trying to correct a few mistakes I made or points I didn't clarify well enough. And I would like to speak first about the background and some basic concepts. Then I will address the question which, of course, is at the center, the use of witnessing and the issues in the construction of the narrative. And finally, an unavoidable topic, and that's the historical representation of extreme events like the Holocaust and other catastrophes, human engineered catastrophes of the 20th century, let's say, using the Holocaust as the example here. Now, the background and some basic concepts. The idea for a historical synthesis, for an integrated history of the Holocaust or the Shoah, I don't like the term Holocaust, to tell you the truth. It has been, unfortunately, Hollywoodized in the 70s, and since then it sounds so the Shoah or the extermination of the Jews of Europe. The idea that this history could not be only seen from the point of view of the perpetrators is with me from the 70s, and I actually had forgotten that I had already lectured on that. In the mid-70s, it was then published as an article in the Bauer and Rothenstreich volume of a conference on this topic. But it lay dormant because you may remember that at that time, and rightly so, the main line of these studies, as much as there were studies, don't forget that at that time the topic was rather marginal, was really the history of the perpetrators, exemplified and introduced and really led by Raoul Hilberg's work. And it was naturally so because of the archives and because of what looked like essential and had a priority, and it had. That is to explain National Socialism and its policies and the extermination of the Jews. But don't let us forget that already at the same time, in various countries, including Holland and, of course, in Israel, and in the States and Poland, there were the beginnings, well, not the beginnings, the history of the Jewish side was already starting seriously. It had started during the war, and I have a student now writing on the Yiddish historians of the Shoah, mainly during the war and immediately afterwards, was writing in Yiddish, which means that, and Philip Friedman, for example, was one of the earliest. So we have a Jewish historiography, but it developed more seriously in the mid-70s, in my opinion, and became a historiography on its own, except that it developed separated from the main current of European, let's say, historiography of these events, which concentrated mainly on Germany. At the same time, again, in the 70s, the local national studies started in earnest. I don't remember when actually the first big study started in Holland, maybe before France. But we all know that in France, because of national hesitations, let's put it that way, Marius and Paxton's book came in, if I remember correctly, in 82 or something like that. So all this started to develop, apart from the German center, in the late 70s, the mid-70s, late 70s, so that a synthetic, if you wish, an integrated history was not really possible before all this had reached a certain stage of historical sophistication. So this is a general background which has to be kept in mind. It's an idea, if you wish, which was a good and maybe important idea early on, but it made no sense to work in that direction before the 80s. In the 80s, and that is the point I wish to make, it's not only the challenge brought by several voices, but in my case by Martin Brochard, the head of the director of the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, in a famous article to which I will come back shortly, a plea for the historicization of National Socialism, 1985. It's not only that brought back the idea something must be done to bring in the Jewish history into that general history and also of the Jewish dimension, let's put it that way, and also the history of the surrounding world, if you wish, because it was one unit. It's not only that. It is the atmosphere of that period that enhanced the intellectual challenge. You have to, again, to remember, for some of you, it's the case, for others certainly not, that 85 was a crucial year in terms of the atmosphere, mainly in Germany, but also in the way 85, 86, 87. Now 85, it so happens I was in Berlin, and therefore it touched me very directly at the Wissenschaftskolleg, 85, 86. What happened, and most of you will have forgotten that, the year, of course, the 40th year after the end of the war, which already had followed the 50th year after the accession of Hitler to the chancellorship in 83, which had already brought its a series of debates, but the 40th year after the end of the war really brought to the fore voices which had not been heard for a long time, voices also of very prominent people, and not pleasant voices. I will not go over the arguments, but Rudolf Augstein, the editor, director, owner of the Spiegel, in January 85 wrote a famous, at least for me, famous article in the Spiegel, which actually had all the Nolte thesis before Nolte even published his first article in the new direction, let's say, or in the very pointed direction a few months later in a volume published in England. You had Augstein, then you had Gollo Mann, the son of Thomas Mann, writing in Die Zeit, and all that, you had to read it more or less every day, saying who after 40 years after Waterloo would remember the crimes of Napoleon. I mean, enough is enough, ein Schlussstrich, which was pretty strange coming from Gollo Mann, but very conservative historian, very national in a way, but also comparing with Waterloo and the end of the Napoleonic era. And then you had a series of publications like Martin Brochard's Plädoyer für die Historisierung des Nationalsozialismus. You had Hillgruber, you had Nolte, all this literature is known to most of you. You had also things that you will not have in mind, that during that summer of 1985, the City Theater of Frankfurt was planning to perform Fassbinder's The City, Garbage and Death. Many would think that an anti-Semitic play. That it's only, it was a terrible debate. And only at the last moment when it was the premiere was supposed to take place, the leaders of the Jewish community in Germany came on stage and sat there and prevented the play from being performed. So having all that as a background, and one thing after the other, I won't mention many other things, and being on the spot in a way, after already a clash with Martin Broszat at the conference, on the first international conference on the Holocaust in Stuttgart in 1984, a year beforehand, created a sense of urgency, which then was, in a way, came together with the intellectual issues which were raised, in particular in Broszat's article, because of all those people. He certainly was the most serious and the most respected historian. Nolte has been always considered a little bit of an eccentric and became even more. 85 ended and 86 started. And so let's leave all the others aside. Broszat was certainly a voice to be respected and to be listened to. And his idea of the historicization, to which we may return in the debate, but which is certainly known to most of you here, well known, is actually speaking of the German nation living and surviving under the Nazi regime. That is, he was saving the flow of the history of the nation under this, in a way, criminal leadership, showing how the nation, the national forces, helped, of course, and reinforced this regime, but were actually independent of it. It always reminds me of Edgar Wright's film, TV film Heimat, which was the expression of the same ideas which were coming up. So all that was a lot, and I thought that it had to be answered. So I wrote my reflections on the historicization of National Socialism, which brought Martin Broszat's answer, saying, well, okay, you would criticize me, so let's exchange letters which will be published about these issues. Now, for me, the final point was, of course, the one raised in his first letter, which has been repeated many times in the meantime, and I was astonished that he said it or wrote it, but he did. And the famous argument was, well, the victims, the Jews, and their descendants are really unable to deal objectively with this history because of because they carry the burden of the past in such a subjective way that they really are the guardians, if you wish, of a mythical memory. And that was the famous sentence, a mythical memory. But they're an obstacle to a more rational German historiography. Well, that really was, for me, the Schlussstrich in a sense. And I had no choice but to ask whether those who had been in the Hitler Youth and in the Wehrmacht, I didn't know also in the party, as Broszat was actually, but that I didn't know at the time, and nobody knew it except after his death. This was discovered, and or had been in various Nazi organizations, were burdened also by quite a heavy subjectivity. So this, in a way, started for me, at least, the idea. Now I will do it if need be. We have to show that there is a Jewish dimension to this history, and that victims can deal with the objectively with those same years as much as anybody else, and that actually anybody can deal objectively with that past when that person, that historian, becomes aware of the place where he or she stands, from where you are speaking, from where, and then accept your subjectivity and even use it to a point. I will come back to that point a little bit later. That is, this subjectivity did not have to be rejected, but had to be consciously accepted and stated in a way, and then even used in your way of writing history, in your way of choosing the material and so on, but very clearly and very explicitly. This is the background, and excuse me for that briefing in a way, but in a sense it explains the motivation more than just an intellectual argument. Now, the basic concepts. From the beginning, I argued for myself and then in writing that there was no, and I remember a discussion with Carlo Ginzburg many years ago, there was no one conceptual framework which could, in a sense, interpret the Shoah, the extermination of the Jews of Europe, not for any mystical reason, of course not, but because there were several histories converging almost due to a series of unforeseeable events converging at various stages, and which had originally nothing to do with each other, very little, but converged and created the background and the impulse that led to the extermination. And that, but I argued, although there is no single framework, and as you know, many had been tried, and the latest fad, but that's gone as well, was modernity. Well, modernity, of course, can be human nature as well. More or less, that's the level of generalization of modernity, and we can go into that, but I thought that concepts like modernity could not deal with the mid-level material. It could deal in very general terms of something which actually, when you got one step down, you were not in National Socialism anyway, you were somewhere. So general concept was at the very beginning ousted, which did not mean that you couldn't use partial concepts to explain sequences in various ways. And I would suggest that I would just go over three of them. In ideological terms, what I called redemptive anti-Semitism. In political social terms, the collapse of liberalism. And in economic terms, the advantages, of course, of the disappearance of the Jews. And the three together, within a narrative to which I will come back, could give sequences of interpretation, which was not a unified interpretation, but maybe a unified interpretation was absolutely not necessary, and you could deal with various sequences of that history. For some of you who may be skeptical about the impossibility of creating a general framework, let me just say that the Jewish history, and many people not being aware of it, developed very differently from, let's say, the history of fascism and Nazi, leading to the convergence of National Socialism and Jewish history, mainly in Eastern Europe. It was a totally different history, and you cannot simply put it under a simple roof. So let me, in a few words, mention these three ideas. Redemptive anti-Semitism I have already dealt with many times in one word. It is the most extreme, you have to look at it in ideal typical terms. It's not something real, it's an ideal type of the most extreme anti-Semitism, which meant either or, entweder oder. Either the Jews disappear and humanity is redeemed, saved, or the Jews prevail and humanity disappears or is exterminated. Hitler, and of course I don't see a direct line, but Hitler mentioned this idea of either or in Mein Kampf and many times after. This was the ideology of a very small group. I never would have argued, in parentheses, as Goldhagen did, that this was a kind of eliminationist ideology of the whole of German society, not at all. This was a very small group, of course, first and foremost Adolf Hitler and his closest circle, and others at many levels of society, and at, for example, the technological level, a man like Hans Kammler and others who were so important in really dealing with the daily process of constructing gas chambers and so on. They believed in this to the end of the year and of the war and beyond, Mengele and people like that. So you had at all levels people really believing that it was a sacred task to get rid of the Jews, and as there were no countervailing forces, as there was no opposition because of the ordinary anti-Semitism, or because of other reasons, because people were afraid or indifferent, a small group was enough to push the whole thing through, to push the whole thing through to the very end. And don't forget that the last train with Jewish children from Paris left the city 2 days before Paris was liberated. And we spoke of Isieux, the home, the colony, children's colony of Isieux was taken a few months before. But the Jews of the Sephardi Jews of the Aegean Islands were brought to by boat. The boat came from Greece to the islands, took the Jewish community of Rhodes and a small island coast, 1,600 Jews, brought them in 10 days sailing to Athens, and then 10 days by train, because of bombings and everything, in July 44 to Auschwitz, where they were immediately killed. So you have a drive here which, if it had been only a matter of bureaucracy and so on, would have died down of its own because of the difficulties of the total war. But the difficulties of the total war didn't stop the extermination of the hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews from May 1944 to the beginning of the summer of 1944. There was a drive which was ideological, essentially, and came from the top, at least in my opinion. Now, the social political framework is pretty obvious. The collapse of the liberal order all over the Western world, but of course, continental Europe, it meant the collapse of the political, social, economic order which allowed the Jews to be integrated in European or Western society, let's say European. The moment this order collapsed, and the reasons for its collapse are known to everybody here, and the fascist movements rose all over Europe, the Jews were, the dissimulation of the Jews started. As well in Romania as in Hungary, as in eventually, of course, in Germany and so on, the exception being Italy up to 38. And even that can be discussed today. But in any case, you see the collapse of that order, which in a way carried Jewish emancipation and integration, and the dissimulation, then exclusion, then concentration, then extermination of the Jewish European populations. The third argument, the third framework would be the economic argument. And as you know, a lot of emphasis has been put on the economic argument by Goetz, Ali, and others. I recognize, of course, I recognize that for many populations, the advantage of the disappearance of the Jews was to get the mattress, or as a Polish observer said very well, he watched the killings in Lithuania near Vilna, and he said, and he saw the shooting of 200 Jews and said, well, for the Germans, these are 200 enemies of humanities which are gone. For the Lithuanians around, these are 200 pairs of pants and or shoes, and indeed. And so you can go from there to the Reichsbank and make the same argument. It's absolutely true, but it's not the prime motive. It is certainly a motive, and you see it all the time, but it's a derivative. It's not because of the economic incentive that the Jews of Europe were exterminated. It is a kind of profit, secondary benefit from this extermination. And I saw myself after the war watching people I knew how it was difficult to get your house back or your apartment back in Paris because the French who had got it, they didn't want to give it back. So of course, if the Jews if nobody had come back, it would have been very advantageous. This is pretty clear. Now let me get to the second part, which deals with both the witnessing and the construction of the narrative. Excuse me for a second. Now, the impossibility of having a single framework led me, because there was no other way, to construct a chronicle. Now, a colleague of mine, Dan Diener, whom many of you may know or know of, argued very rightly, supported this, said, well, this is a chronicle after conceptualization has failed, and not a chronicling before the beginning of conceptualization. That is, it's not going back to the most primitive way of writing history, one event after the other, but it is, because of the lack of an integrated framework, the only way of really rendering this history. At least that's what I thought. One of the technical difficulties in chronicling, and I remember again discussing this with Carlo Gainsbourg years ago, was to, well, in the first volume, The Years of Persecution, there was a unity of place, that is Germany, essentially. And so it was relatively easy to present the events, even in chronicle fashion, within a unity of place. But once the history spread to the whole of Europe, to all the various layers of European society, to Nazi politics, to the churches, and so on, and even to extra-European influences, American or Palestinian Jews, and so on, then this unity of place, of course, wouldn't play. And that is why the chronicling is organized in very tight unities of time succeeding each other every 6 months. It was simply an organizing way to make things comprehensible. Otherwise, except for some specialists, it would have been completely incomprehensible. So this was a technicality which created a problem for a long time for me, until I hit on this idea of the unity of time, but of very short sequences of time in order to organize the chronicle. And I don't hesitate to speak of a chronicle, also it's really out of it's certainly not the most recent fashion of writing history. Now, let me touch on one of the core topics, and that is the problem of witnessing before coming back to the building, to the construction of the narrative. The use of witnesses, or the use of the introduction of Jewish history into the general history was not linked to witnessing. It was bringing in whatever I could find or I could understand because of the languages of Jewish history having been written on the event. It was essential. Many of you are aware of some aspects of it, but let us take a simple example. The relations, let's say, between Jews and Germans, but Jews and Poles, or Jews and Ukrainians. Most of the national sources will deal with it, but not deal with it as historians looking at it from the Jewish perspective deal with it. In the detail that you would have from the Jewish side, in the perception you have from the Jewish side. Jan Gross's book, which is very well known, The Neighbors, would not have been written, if I may say, or at least not now, or not when it was written a few years ago, by a Polish historian. And it created quite a scandal, you may remember, when it was published. You had to have this perspective in order to write this dimension of history, and therefore, if you wanted to know about resistance movement, about the ephemeral resistance, and about the more long-lasting ones, if you wanted to know about the Jewish councils and the internal debates, often it was in languages not understood by things were written in Yiddish. The whole Jewish press in Warsaw was Yiddish, Polish, Hebrew. So you had really to know the Hebrew at least in order to be able to follow this. You absolutely needed this Jewish dimension in the general history in order to make it comprehensible. Now, somebody a few years ago asked me a very simple question. He said, all right, it all gives due respect, Brochart's word, to a dimension which has to be there, but does it add scientifically to our knowledge? I said, of course it does. Resistance, attitudes, and so on. But if you look at this dimension, and mainly at the diaries, to which I will come in a second, you see a very strange thing which you could not see otherwise. You have to compare the diaries all over Europe. You suddenly understand what seems maybe self-understood now, but you understand that the victims were really the only ones, at least the last ones, the only ones to understand their fate. They did not. In the West, the pieces were often not pulled together. In the East, the rumors were coming constantly, but people in Warsaw thought that the killings in Vilna came from the fact that the Lithuanian Jews had accepted the Red Army and the Russian and the Soviet occupation 39-41 or 40-41 with enthusiasm, and that's why the Germans were killing the Lithuanian Jews. It couldn't happen in Warsaw, and this was at the mid-level, this was the opinion only a very tiny group started understanding that maybe this was a general policy. Here you have extraordinary documents, and let me just, and this was so, while the others in many countries were well aware. And this then came into the newspapers in Germany from 43 on, that the Jews were being exterminated. But the Jews themselves didn't understand, which explains in part, the lack of resistance, which in any case was impossible, but still the added passivity, which has always been a kind of troubling question, and secondly, explain the smoothness of the process. This was a smooth process without any difficulty except finding the right trains. The Jews went because of the physical deprivation, but also because they believed they go to work somewhere. There is this incredible diary, which I couldn't include because it was published after the years of extermination in France, the diary of Hélène Ber, B-E-R-R, which is not very known. It's now in English. And I certainly recommend very much that you read it. She was a very wealthy bourgeoisie. Her father had been one of the vice presidents of Péchinet. I think that is very wealthy French family, and she writes in that tone, but then more and more tragically, about her life in Paris until her deportation in the summer, just before the liberation to Auschwitz and to her death. And she worked at the Hôpital Rothschild in Paris in the end of 1943. And she says, yesterday, they, that could be the milice or the French gendarmerie or the German police, probably the French, came and took 44 patients. One woman was paralyzed of the face and of the tongue. Another one had drains in her belly. Another one was about to give, a women's hospital, was about to give birth within hours. She says, and she enumerates these women, and she says, taking these people to work, it doesn't make sense. Most of them will die on the way. How can they work? Well, of course, Hélène Ber, at the end of 1943, didn't understand that there was no question of working here. And a year before, you see, that's the comparison of diaries. A German soldier writes from Auschwitz, from the city of Auschwitz, the town of Auschwitz. I just arrived in Auschwitz. He was on his way to the Eastern Front. He wrote to his family, mind you. And that's what makes it so well known. The Jews are arriving here at the rate of 7,000 to 8,000 a week, and then they die a hero's death in Heldentod. And it's nice to see the world, he writes. So that this ordinary German soldier writes home to say the Jews are being killed in Auschwitz. Hélène Ber in Paris says, to have paralyzed people work, that doesn't make much sense. Of course, I have tens of examples like that, but it shows you that there is a dimension here to explain the whole picture, which otherwise, if you see only German documents or only Dutch police documents, you simply miss a whole part of history. The history turns into statistics or turns into a kind of partly incomprehensible aspect. So now, why the diaries? Why the diaries in this Jewish history? We will discuss it, I'm sure. Look, I myself wrote a memoir years and years ago, so I would theoretically be in favor of memoirs, but I'm aware. And what I wanted to get was the immediate raw reaction of the writer to the event. That was one of the aims of creating this disbelief in the reader, to bring in the disbelief of the writer, and these voices could come only from people, in a way, opening their mouths and their eyes. What is that? Like Hélène Ber said, sending paralyzed people to work. And all the examples here. This was the only way. The moment you write a memoir, as wonderful as many memoirs are, you necessarily, even if it's shortly after the war, but mainly in the 60s, the 70s and onwards, you know already the end of the story. You know the fate. You cannot simply express your absolute amazement directly at events which you already know. And you know the history of it, which has already been written, or part of it, and you tend to reorganize your own experiences a little bit to create again a kind of coherence in your own life. So that memoirs are included and should be included, of course, Ruth Krüger and others, Klüger. But the diaries were the main instrument for me to express what I wanted to express from the beginning. It was this sense of amazement, which I hoped would create the same sense of amazement on the reception side that is for the reader. Now, the main argument would be this is really a very subjective way of constructing things, and here I come to the problem of the construction of the narrative, or at least I could take in various directions. Apart from the technicalities, the problem of the subjective choice of the sources and the juxtaposition of the sources, because I had letters from German soldiers, I had diaries from Goebbels to the private so-and-so who arrived in Auschwitz, and all that was juxtaposed or put in comparison with Jewish voices. So the effect was not only of the Jewish voice alone in the desert, but others saying things which, like this German, saying, well, they come here and really they are dire heroes, this, and Ellen Baer a year later saying, well, what is that? So it's really, the problem was choosing. And I was well aware that here I was approaching a domain which was going to the limits of history in a way, because of this, not that anything there was not absolutely documented, but I choose. And now I come to the point I made at the beginning. Subjectivity you have to accept. Everybody writing about this history writes from somewhere. If you are Canadian or Dutch or whatever, Jewish or not Jewish, in the face of this material, and that was La Capra's argument in a conference we had at UCLA, where Carlo was one of the main speakers in 1991, I think, with Hayden White and so on. La Capra's argument was the subject position of the speakers is what determines their speaking, and you have to become aware of it and state from where you speak. But I didn't rely on that, and there have been some critics saying, well, these voices, you know, we know them. No, we don't know them. And I relied on my subjective response. Over, I would say, 60 or 70% of the various letters and diaries, it's a lot, of the Jews, but of all the others, were not known to me, and I have dealt with this history for 40 years professionally, were not known to me, or I knew it existed and never read it because I thought in other terms about all this before I went and read it. Moshe Flinker in Brussels, I knew of him for years, but I had never read him. I had read, of course, Etty Hillesum or Anne Frank. And I will come back to those known images. But I didn't know Ellen Baer, of course, but I didn't know many of the Yiddish diaries and so on, which I got translated. So that and when I reacted in terms of emotion, and I was taken by surprise by some of this material, a letter written by a young girl from Drancy to her father who was hiding in Paris, saying, Papa, in French, that of course was stronger for me. Ne t'inquiète pas, je serai de retour dans quelques semaines. So I will be back very soon. Just don't worry. I'm with very good people who are leaving tomorrow. I'm leaving my watch and things with neighbors in another room. And of course, she was killed on arrival in Auschwitz. So reading that, suddenly my breath was taken away. It was unexpected, and I decided I will go by my own sense of my own reactions to the material and to the collusion of the material. Maybe there are better methods. But here I very sincerely, honestly relied on the reaction of somebody who was well aware of the general history, so not a naive historian, I would say. So here you have the Brochard's accusation of the subjectivity of the victims, not allowing them to write this history, can be turned around, and I could say, and we could say, all of us, yes, they can. But their subjectivity helps them to sense things that otherwise you don't think. You don't sense. I remember a friend, a departed friend, Vidal Naquet, some of you here may know, writing to another friend, Zeev Sternhell, historian of fascism, and writing to him, Zeev wrote in French, about French fascism. You don't understand la vérité interstitielle, the interstices in the, between stones in a wall. You don't read really. Well, I'm not sure the argument is good, but I would say the subjectivity of the writer helps him to catch the vérité interstitielle and to sense this is the right document. And in parentheses, I wrote this to Hans Mommsen, a colleague of mine, German, famous historian of the Third Reich. I said, well, we may be disagreeing on many things. He's a good friend. But we certainly, our generation, senses somehow the material. It cannot be explained. So this is a matter, of course, of debate. But I wanted to. Now, let me say a word about familiar documents. Well, there is a young Israeli historian, well, young for me, he's 50, let's say, who has argued in a critical article saying, well, we know all those testimonies, we have read all that, this is nostalgia, this is nonsense. But there are diaries which are known, of course. But you see, there are those indelible images that Frank von Frey spoke about here, or wrote in an article. He should have been here, I understand, today, but he's in New York, about the necessity of keeping those images. And he based his article on a book by Avishai Margalit on the ethics of memory. We, as political and social beings, are not. That is the detached history that Pierre Nora has spoken of in his famous introduction to the Lieu de Mémoire. It's not our way of writing history. An engaged history is a history where you have to, there is a responsibility of memory and not this completely, this history in the void which Nora has practiced in a way and talked about. So it doesn't go in line with much of historical writing today, but it has certainly a strong group of supporters. We are social and political beings. In a way, we have a responsibility of remembering those images. And Frank von Frey wrote about Nuit et Brouillard by Alain René, and the images. And Nuit et Brouillard has been seen by generations of students. It's a 55 film. And today, if you show it, it creates the same kind of amazement, let's put it that way, or disbelief among the generation of the 20, of people in their 20s, as it did when I saw it the first time in 1955. So Anne Frank, of course, it's a problem because it's an iconic text which everybody has read in high school. It may be one of those things which are more problematic, but I would say some elements in it are seen anew by each group of readers and each generation of readers, and I would be in favor of not excluding even the very known, and I did not. I certainly used Etty Hillesum, Anne Frank, also they are very known, at least Etty Hillesum very known in Holland. Now let me come to the last point, I've been too long, and that is the representation of extreme events in history. And I'm relating only to one very good article by Alon Confino, a cultural historian at the University of Virginia, who wrote a long article on the years of extermination. He praised, of course, the use of the articulation of sensation, what he calls the sense of the epoch. And he says historical understanding is recreating sensation. Well, it's true for Huizinga in cultural history and so on. Cliometrics, I would be more doubtful, but we are not dealing with cliometrics, and in that sense he's right. But it's Dilthey, it's not so new, it's the deep understanding for the past, recreation of what Confino calls the sensation of the past. And I immediately think of the first page of The Waning of the Middle Ages, which is a marvelous recreation of the sensation of the everyday at the end of the Middle Ages. Now, he says that where I made a mistake, and I want to address that, is to put on the one hand the thorough study of history as a profession, and then the creation of the sensation by the voices and so on as a different process. But I never said that. I said a thorough study of the event without eliminating the elements of disbelief which we have when we the first time encounter those events. That is, I absolutely agree, and he is right. Understanding, verstehen, needs both this very strict construction, historical construction, and a recreation, a rearticulation of sensation within the same process of exploring that past, and something exploring it and being astonished yourself by not only by the documents in the most basic archival way, but also by the writings of the participants, and so on and so forth. So I had already what I was sure of before even starting this was that we cannot allow the history, cannot allow. It would be, you see, I hesitate. I would prefer to see this history without indifferent closure. That is a kind of continuation for the reasons which I mentioned when I mentioned Avishai Margalit and mentioned Frank Frey. That is, there is an ethical responsibility here, and there is a social, political responsibility, and so on. But, and of course, within the framework of the historian's work. So I had thought years ago about introducing the voice of the historian as a comment and breaking the narrative with comments in order to create this let's say, effect. And then I replaced the comments of the historians by the voices of the witnesses as I presented them here. The main thing is to write this history without coming to this indifferent closure, without really reaching what Jürgen Habermas at the height of the historische Streit called eine Art Schadensabwicklung, a kind of settling of damages, like in insurance. Thank you very much. Thank you.
gentlemen, thank you so much, Professor Friedländer. We will now have a panel discussion. I would like to give the floor to Professor Carlo Ginzburg. And after Professor Carlo Ginzburg has phrased his question, I will ask Professor Friedländer to have a reply.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shaul Friedländer, for your very dense and challenging presentation on your great achievement. I would like to make some comments and then I will ask a couple of questions. I would like to start from, first of all, I'm not an expert in this area of studies. I'm an historian, but I'm working usually on different subjects. I would like to start from an article published by in Annales 2009 by Florent Breillard on a comment on Christopher Browning, Ian Kershaw, Shaul Friedländer and Raoul Hilberg. And there is a passage in which Breillard says, although Shaul Friedländer published in 1976 in Revue des Études Juives an article on the extermination of the European Jews pour une étude historique globale, integrated history of the extermination, Shaul Friedländer always constantly referred to his debate with Martin Broszat as the starting place of his project. Why? But he doesn't give an answer. And you gave an answer in a sense, but I wonder whether the issue is more complicated. And so actually my reaction in reading your exchange with Broszat was a bit different. So I would like to focus on a specific topic which I think played an important role in your two-volume works, meaning Alltagsgeschichte. Now, you say very clearly, I mean, I was also shocked in reading the exchange by the opposition between the mythical memory of the victims and their descendants vis-à-vis the possibility of a German scientific approach to this phenomenon. But then there were other topics which emerged in the exchange, including Alltagsgeschichte. And so you said, I'm not opposed to Alltagsgeschichte as such, although there is a danger of, let's say, providing a sort of, you mentioned this in your presentation, I mean, stressing the normality of life, notwithstanding the criminal aspects of the Nazi regime. Now, in a certain moment, Broszat said, but actually it would be possible to use Alltagsgeschichte in a different perspective, and he mentioned the case of Leopold Neumeier from Würzburg, a man who was persecuted by the Gestapo as a Jew and as an homosexual. And this case plays a not irrelevant role in the first volume of your book. Now, this is not a detail, in my view, or if you like, it's a detail, but it's a revealing detail. I would say that you turned, let's say, Broszat's accusation or criticism on its head, also because you have been able to use Alltagsgeschichte in a different perspective, stressing not the normality, or if you like, the normality within the anormality. And I think your project about rescuing the voices of the victims is also related to that. Now, you spoke about subjectivity. Here, I think there is a problem, and maybe my first question. In my view, it would be important to make a distinction between the subjectivity of the historian and the subjectivity of the victims. They are not identical. Actually, they are very different, and there is a deep gap between them. Now, I would like to mention very quickly the distinction which is familiar to anthropologists between the emic and ethic perspective. In other words, the perspective of the actors, the emic perspective, and the perspective of the observer, the ethic perspective. Now, it seems to me that your subjectivity is very different from theirs, because not only because you know the end of the story, but also because you have been able to place or replace the blind subjectivity, in principle, of Hélène Baer as well, although she's not in the book. But I mean, that blind subjectivity, that blind perception, and a very different perception of some of the authors of the diaries. Now, how was it possible? I would say that there is a principle, a narrative principle, which you didn't mention, which is montage. Montage is crucial. Actually, in my view, this is the first book in which montage became the principle of organization of the evidence and of the narrative as well. So, montage as a cognitive device. This book would have been impossible without cinema. So, I mean, it's a very imaginative use of montage. And so you have the shift, a sort of camera shift, between, let's say, details, blind details, imperfect details, very circumscribed perspectives, and a sort of general picture which is yours. Now, this already implies, in my view, a question about the limits of keeping the disbelief, and I will go back to that at the very end of my comment. Now, you stressed the importance of the victims' voices, and this was a sort of crucial step. I was really surprised in reading Hilberg's passage on an Italian intellectual reacting in a certain way to Auschwitz, and the Italian intellectual is Primo Levi, who is not even mentioned in the table of names. So for him, I mean, it was no. That's interesting because his perspective did not focus on the victims. So Primo Levi was an Italian intellectual. He had no name in a way. For you, there are names, unknown names, previously unknown names, known names, and so on and so forth. Names, as you mentioned, commenting on Klarsfeld, are crucial. Okay. Now, what about the perpetrators? I mean, in your 1976 essay, you already mentioned the three elements, meaning perpetrators, bystanders, and victims, which later on Hilberg used as a title for his collection of essays. In my view, the role played by the victims and the victims' voice in your work, in this great work, is very different from the perpetrator's role. And here I can see a possible development of your work. Obviously, as historians, as practicing historians, we all know that there are no definitive works on any possible topic. So, in reading this achievement, I will think about possible developments. And in my view, a possible development might focus on the perpetrators, but in a different perspective, which would take into account what you did with the victims. It seems to me that although you certainly overcame the alleged opposition between intentionalists and functionalists, and so you stress the fact that the very word, the very expression, final solution, changed its meaning a long time. The reader has still the feeling that the perpetrators didn't change. In other words, the changing perspective of the perpetrators is never, in my view, a real point debated in the book or analyzed in the book. But you provided some really shocking documents, including, for instance, Himmler's comment in May 1940 about, let's say, exterminating a population which would be a Bolshevik act. Very different, un-German, you see. I mean, I'm referring to your quotation, un-German. And then there is that other passage at the very beginning of your second volume on, I mean, Hitler having a sort of briefing with high officers, and one of them recorded that I mean, destroying the Polish elite would be a method which would be incompatible with our methods, but we have to do it. So I think that in order to understand how this monstrous machinery was built, we have to imagine something which is really shocking. But here we have a different kind of disbelief, meaning that some moral scruples, moral maybe in quotation marks, but moral scruples or some kind of scruples were also present, I mean, in people like Himmler or Goebbels. So even Hitler had to learn that he was committed to the final solution, which seems to be a paradox, but it's true. So this is what I learned. I learned it from your book. So the fact that this emerged, it was not there as a project. So I mean, I think that we have to understand how it's possible that this. Here the word disbelief is inevitable, but this unbelievable machinery was set up. So I think that this is an element which will be developed, I think. Now, there is a possible objection which you already raised, empathy. You had that exchange with Christopher Browning about empathy, and you said, well, we may empathize with the victims, not with the perpetrators. In my view, and here I disagree from Browning's answer, not from Browning's practice. I believe that empathy is absolutely useless as a cognitive device. There is no empathy. The victim's mind and heart and the perpetrator's minds and hearts are inaccessible to us. There is no empathy. We are trying to make inferences on the basis of clues of different kind of documents, as you did with the victims. And so we may do the same with the perpetrators, including Himmler or even Hitler. So the problem is not to empathize with Himmler, which would certainly be impossible. But I would argue that it's impossible even to empathize with Anna Frank. There is no empathy. Everybody's mind, including possibly our own, is a black box. I mean, this may be a paradox. But so it's a different kind of approach, I must say, in which, and here again, there is a possible disagreement, comparison would play a major role. You resisted to comparison for very understandable reasons, and certainly there is a possibility of banalizing the uniqueness of the Shoah. However, as you know, every historical event is unique. So comparison, as Mark Bloch said a long time ago, can be an instrument in order to assess the specificity of the event. Now, it seems to me that a comparison between different genocides is not particularly helpful. What I'm thinking about is a sort of horizontal comparison between contiguous phenomena. Now, this has been suggested several times. What I'm going to say is banal, but I think there is much more work to be done. First of all, with the so-called euthanasia project. Because, I mean, the continuity is crucial. And then the problem of the extermination of the Jewish elite. I mean, you mentioned that leaflet of the White Rose group, in which the comparison is made between the extermination of the Jews and the extermination of the Polish elite.
Yeah.
So I think this is absolutely crucial in order to understand how the extermination of the Jews up to the last children was thinkable and workable. So, and then there is, of course, but this is well known, the let's say, technique. In my view, a sharp distinction should be made between the technique as fragmentation of guilt feelings and the technique as fragmentation of responsibilities. Because, I mean, obviously, the responsibility is there, but the guilt feelings are something different. And the guilt feelings were certainly an obstacle for the perpetrators. So, and now I'm going quickly because I spoke too much. I would like to mention the issue of the gray zone. I mean, the expression for me is, let's say, associated with Primo Levi's book. But I was quite surprised in reading the introduction to this book, which you know much better than I, by Detlef Peukert, Inside Nazi Germany. Conformity, Opposition, and Racism in Everyday Life. I have the English translation here, in which the metaphor of the black and white is mentioned in order to say, but if we go to Alltagsgeschichte, we will find something which would imply a lot of gray nuances. Now, obviously, I mean, I'm sure that Primo Levi never read Peukert, but as you remember, Primo Levi's argument about the gray zone was raised after Christopher Browning's lecture at UCLA, when he came invited by you, I think. And I remember that I had an exchange with Browning, because I said that you should read Primo Levi. And actually, he included Primo Levi at the very end of his book, Ordinary Man. Now, it seems to me that here we have a powerful device which should be used in order to understand how the machinery was possible. And here I'm really skeptical about the cognitive potential of what you call redemptive anti-Semitism. Because as you said, I mean, this time you also said something which I probably you didn't say before, but I may be wrong, that this is a sort of ideal type. So, I mean, I wonder whether the cognitive potential of this ideal type is very high. Because certainly, you are right in stressing the fact that nothing on this, in this domain could happen against Hitler. But this is something different from saying that Hitler was behind everything was done. It's very different. It's very different. So, I think that, let's say, if you circumscribe, as you did, the, let's say, spread of this attitude of redemptive anti-Semitism, we are left with something else. Ordinary anti-Semitism, and I would say moral scruples. In other words, and I think this is something which I certainly learned from Christopher Browning's book, to kill a man, a human being, to kill 100 human beings, is difficult. It's not easy. One has to, in order to achieve this, a lot of scruples, I mean, distribution of alcohol, say something. So, on the side of the perpetrators, there is more to be understood, I would say. My final comment. I was very sympathetic with what you said in the introduction to your first volume about estrangement and the cognitive role of estrangement. We totally agree on this. At the very end of the introduction to the second volume, you said that you would like to keep, I think these are the last words of the introduction. I wish to offer a thorough historical study of the extermination of the Jews of Europe without eliminating or domesticating that initial sense of disbelief. In other words, and here maybe we disagree once again, notwithstanding our general agreement, I would stress the word initial, because it seems to me that we have to keep this initial sense of disbelief, but then we have to go beyond this. And I think knowledge is, let's say, using estrangement in order to achieve a deeper knowledge. So the possibility of, let's say, keeping the initial sense of disbelief, but also going beyond it, is more than a possibility. And I think your work is the demonstration of that. Thank you.
If I have an hour to answer. Well, I will go as fast as I can, but of course, Carlo's remarks are worth a long discussion. What Florent Braillard mentioned in his article in Annales is indeed correct. I had written that article, which I then published in the Bauer Rotenstreich. You see, I even here forgot that I had published it in French before in '76, but I forgot it. That's why I came back. I forgot it. Somehow went into other directions and it escaped my mind. And even when I dealt with Brochat, I didn't remember that I had already, or when I started working on this project, I thought it started with the debate with Brochat. I had completely forgotten that I had already, years before that, come with the same idea. Well, that's this black box, you see. Now, the Alltag, that's really important. What my argument against Brochat's was against Brochat's use of the Alltag and not general history of Alltagsgeschichte, which I was well aware of, but he had an agenda, and there are specialists here on Brochat, so we'll hear from them, but my sense is that he wanted to retrieve, to save in a way, to redeem, if I may use the word, the normality of the German Alltag. And he mentioned Obermayr, the Jewish homosexual, but that came pretty late in his work. And Obermayr is, if you look at the Alltagsgeschichte or Alltag in Bayern, the Bayern project, the Bavaria project, you will not find the criminality in the Alltag, or very little. And Peukert, precisely, who was a left-wing historian, himself gay, by the way, of course, understood very well the criminality of the Alltag and reintroduced it in his, so that Peukert already, without saying it, used the Alltag in a way against Brochat's vision of which I understood as a normalization. Maybe I am too severe in this, but others, indeed Peukert, mentioned very clearly that Alltag can also be criminal Alltag. If you want, and I mentioned it in the introduction, a metaphor for Brochat's Alltag is really Edgar Wright's first sequence of Heimat, which barely mentions in a split of a second the extermination of the Jews. One SS coming from that village speaks of them going through the chimney, and that is that. There are some photos. So, and you have that, I mean, this has been an argument against Joachim Fest's Hitler biography and so on and so forth. That is the saving of the normality of Schabach, the village, under the Nazi regime, which these people didn't even understand what it was all about. So this is, of course, a myth, because since then, and many years have gone by, many studies have come out about the knowledge of the extermination in the population. And recently there have been 3, 4, 5 monographs, Longerich, Dieter Pohl, and there are many. And they show that Germans, because of the letters, because of Hitler's own speeches, knew perfectly well, not exactly how, that the Jews were being massacred and eventually totally exterminated. I have a bishop, Bishop Burning, saying in February 1942, which is a few weeks after the Wannsee conference, how he knew it, I don't know. Es gibt einen Plan, alle Juden zu vernichten. So it was all over. And in 40, let's say in July 42, or in the summer 42, the soldierites, well, they die Heldentod every week, 8,000. So there, and Hitler said it very clearly. And if you were not committed to Nazism, we have the diaries of somebody Broschat mentions in our exchange, who says der Führer has mentioned the extermination of the Jews. And the same expression was used in local newspapers in Saxony, Sächsische something, I forgot now the names. So that what Broschat argued was false. He told me it's only at the end of the war, towards the end in 83, 84, that people became conscious, but this is, no, the consciousness was prior, and was very well spread, not among the victims for the psychological reasons. So that's my opinion on his use of the Alltag, but of course not an opposition to Alltagsgeschichte in general, under any regime, Soviet, Stalinism or Nazi Germany. The Alltag can be also the criminal Alltag against gays and so on and so forth. Now, what about the perpetrators? The montage first. The montage is, of course, very important, and I was well aware of montage when I didn't mention it here because I thought this would be an argument immediately used against me. But I knew immediately that the cuts which I used were transferred from cinema, because you couldn't have this chronicle or this narrative without moving from topic to topic. The problem was where to cut and where to move to another topic and what topic. You had to avoid the sense of a kind of chaos, even in those very short temporal sequences. So the problem of the montage or the editing was central to the narration. Yes, I admit here that I was well aware of it and used it as well as I could, but thinking that after all, if, let's say, Lanzmann in Shoah used it, and others, of course, why couldn't I use it for a historical work after all? There was no reason why not to use this narrative. Now the perpetrators. Here you said many important things, but the gist of your argument, if I understand it correctly, is that we do not have a sense, of course we don't, of the mind of the black box, which is the mind of the perpetrators, nor do we have a sense of the mind of the victims. The mind of every individual is his or her own mind, but you speak of the moral scruples among the perpetrators, quoting Himmler's memorandum for Hitler on foreign populations in the spring of 1940, which has been quoted very often, that extermination would be a Bolshevik. This is true, and this is also true to a point, I think, that there is no doubt in my mind that whatever murderous musings Hitler may have had about the Jews, the plan for their immediate extermination was not to be seen, in my opinion, until the summer, until the autumn, or the late autumn, in my opinion. Browning would say the early autumn of 1941. So, but it's not because of moral scruples, I think, it's because of practicality. And I think that Himmler, hard to say, but Hitler is very important, because the moment Hitler said this and that would be done, Himmler immediately, of course, told the lie. But let's say that there were hesitations. We don't know now if they were just practical. The idea was to get the Jews out of the German sphere, and to get them A, to Lublin, which didn't work, the territorial plans, B, then to Madagascar, which didn't work, and C, to northern Russia, which was being prepared for half a year at least, and a few weeks after the invasion was still being kept until the autumn. Now, why the change? Not because of a disappearance of the moral inhibitions. They had disappeared, I think, from much before, at least in the central group. Goebbels was maybe even more extreme than Hitler himself. Himmler is more difficult to say. Because the moment the war became a general war, a world war, with the Russians counterattacking in front of Moscow in December 41, and the Americans having entered the war, this notorious idea of the world war, which Hitler had said he would not allow the Jews to survive it, was there. Now, he could not backtrack. Once he had prophesied that the Jews would be exterminated if there was a world war, he couldn't suddenly say, oh, well, maybe not. For the party, for those who believed in him, he could not. But mainly because he did believe, and here we have redemptive anti-Semitism coming back, that if in a general war, which was now would be a long war and a difficult war, and a war with a slight intimation of defeat, the Jews as the arch enemies remained within the Reich and the occupied territories, they would again stab Germany in the back, as they did in 1918. He constantly referred to 1918. The Jews, we lost World War I because of the Jews. Now, if we keep them, so there were no territorial plans, and impossible, the Russians and the English and so on, so now kill them. I mean, it was in his kind of vision, there was an internal, it sat, to express it that way, logic. If you cannot get them out and then have them die slowly in the territorial plans, because Madagascar was under the control of the German police and so on, it was not the Jews would have stayed there. It was dying slowly, slow decimation. Now it becomes urgent because the war, the general war is here, December 41, extermination, that's when things started. I don't think you really, and even those who had some hesitations then adapted, but also adapted their moral arguments, I would say. So Himmler, in his Posen speech of October 1943, says, well, and why the women and the children? I mean, everybody knows that here, because otherwise we'll have Avengers in 20 years from now, so better end it now. So I would, but certainly one has to learn more and more and more about the perpetrators and more and more and more about the victims. But you are right, there is no way of using empathy, but you have to use documents if you can. But of course, at some moment you cannot. You can only from the outside try to understand it as well as possible. Now, comparison of contiguous phenomena, that is, the extermination of the Jews, and just before that, contiguously, the extermination of the mentally ill, the Polish elites to a point, and of course the gypsies. We don't know the numbers. For the mentally ill, we know more or less 70,000 before August 41, when there was a change of method, let's say, and then 70,000 more or less after that, for all the reasons we know, economic, the beds in institutions, the keeping people who are not worth anything, paying for their upkeep or whatever. Now, all that is pretty similar. Extermination, and my homonym Henry Friedländer, he doesn't use the umlaut, said that this was the direct origins of the final solution. And here comes redemptive anti-Semitism again. You see, all these exterminations are exterminations. I mean, I don't make any difference between killing this group, killing that group, killing. There were plans to have some 20, 30 million Slavs die of hunger, eventually the hunger plans. But none of these groups was considered as a danger to the survival of the Aryan race, of the folk and humanity. The Jews, you have now to add the whole mythical history of anti-Semitism going back to Christianity. That is, they are evil per se, at some stages at least, in this long history. And redemptive anti-Semitism, precisely the notion comes from this idea that they were, it's either or we win, or they win. And if they win, we are finished. So that, and that was not said, of course, neither about the Polish elites, nor about the mentally ill, nor about the gypsies, which were social or national problems. The Poles could organize resistance, so kill the elites. But the Jews would eventually destroy everybody, that is, that Hitler fought for. Mein Kampf was the Kampf against the Jew, first of all. And that is why this ideology had a power of its own, and that is what Himmler then says in Posen. If we leave them, they will come back in 20 years. You know, so there is a drive, that's why it went to the end, and why Hitler explained to Antonescu, you see, if we don't now deal with the Hungarian Jews, this is a Judified country, that's why Horthy now tries to, to move to the other side, and that went fast in Hungary. The more the danger was present, and that is the great paradox, the more the Reich was shrinking, and the faster the extermination went, and in corners which nobody thought of, Rhodos, of course, Italy, as you know. But then in Italy there was not enough police, not enough Gestapo people. We have documents on that, and so some of the Italian fascists took over in Venice and so on. But all in all, fast. Now, I would be doubtful about the guilt feelings, but of course some individuals felt guilt feelings, and some simply had difficulties to kill. And that, in that sense, Goldhagen's book, the descriptions are whatever the general thesis is the sense of, killing the child whom you are taking to the forest in Yosefov or wherever. Yes, but that is the killing, the guilt mainly at the level of the Ukrainians, at the level of the Poles, the Lithuanians, and so the pity. More used Germans had a lot of theater, not only vodka, in Auschwitz town, that is the guards, from 6,000-7,000 who came in various phases of Auschwitz. They had comedies, they had the daily life of a guard in Auschwitz is a story by itself, which has been written in part, but only in part. Now, Peukert, and Primo Levi, and the Grey Zone. Here, I didn't exactly understand the argument, so if you wish, of course, Hitler was, of course, not behind everything. But there is a concept which our colleague Ian Kershaw used very nicely, working towards the Führer. Of course, Hitler didn't give orders, and he was a very disorganized, but he intimated to Himmler that now was the time, in December, let's say. And so the machine, in a way, that is the various agencies, they fought against each other for power, for territorial power of in this or that domain. But they all certainly thought that the Führer's wish was the Führer's order. It's a famous expression. So he didn't need to say, but he actually followed very carefully. As you know, the statistics of the extermination were given, put together for Himmler, and then in a abridged form were presented to Hitler, and then Himmler noted, Führer has seen, destroyed. We have, of course, the testimony of the chief statistician of the SS Corps here. Now, the disbelief is an initial sense, but that's enough. My argument was, and that will be my final response, my argument was that history tended to flatten. And look, we have seen the histories of the 70s, the 80s, actually, the tendency to accumulate administrative details, and they are extremely important. I couldn't have worked without all this immense work done. But when you read it, ultimately, it becomes the history of an administration or of a bureaucratic organization. Something makes you almost weary of it. And therefore, this initial sense of disbelief, which we all, many of us, feel when we are confronted with the material, has at least, hopefully, to appear somewhere in the historical narrative itself, in order not to create the area, and then to have the statistics. The gray zone, I simply didn't get the point.
I will come back to this later.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I would like to give the floor to Marieke Weberwoord.
As a PhD student at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, I'm writing a thesis about Dutch concentration camp Herzogenbusch, also known as Camp Vught. And my question to you regards the sources you used to write your impressive and comprehensive study about Nazi Germany and the Jews. You suggest that it's possible to reconstruct the history of the destruction of the European Jews from the victims' point of view.
Not only.
Not only, not only because of the availability of post-war testimonies, but also because of the large amount of diaries and letters. You just said that you choose diaries because of the immediate reaction of the writer, and indeed contemporary sources are more closer to the events. However, on the other hand, you can argue that contemporary sources are structured and censored as well, and you may wonder how immediate on the events they are written. So I was wondering if you could tell a bit more about, you judged the merits of contemporary sources and the way you use them.
What I was looking for, thank you very much, what I was looking for in the diaries, and what I think can be found in the diaries, and I hope there are some examples of it, is not the view the diarist gives of the overall situation. That we can better get from more official documents. Let's say the diarists in Westerbork, I'm more familiar, of course, my familiarity is very limited, but still more with Westerbork than with Herzogenbusch. But let us say, what was the name of the journalist who came somewhat late and then died?
Mechanicus? Philip Mechanicus?
Yes, Mechanicus. It's not, and he came late, so he had an overview, but still I'm not looking for his overview of even of the situation of Dutch Jewry, what was left of it, or the war, because that was self-censored very often because of the fear of this being read. The interesting thing is that Klemperer wrote pretty freely, but gave, and then hid his diaries with a friend, Anne-Marie something, and a non-Jewish friend, and was constantly afraid that it would be found by and put her in danger. So diarists were well aware. No, what I was interested in letters and diaries, the letters were very censored by the writer, because they were afraid that any censor would find them. That is, find the details they were giving. It was really their emotional state which I was interested in, and not, let us say, you have the diary of 12-year-old Rubinovich near Kielce. Rubinovich has no idea of the general. When the Jews are taken to Kielce to organize actually a Jewish council, he says, well, he describes it in a 12-year-old way. But when he says, I'm very sad because I walked to Kielce, which in itself is enough. It was 4 hours walking to go to a dentist. I walked to Kielce because the Jews were not allowed to take any means of transportation. He was 12 years old, but walked 4 hours there, 4 hours back. I was very sad because the police came on the road. I saw them on the road, and they killed the Jewess there on the road. So I'm very sad, which is a child's way of describing things. He doesn't understand anything of the general situation, but he says, I'm really sad, and then he repeats that. Or when he looks at the posters, which are just put in his little hamlet, anti-Semitic posters which the policeman, and he says, and he describes them, I forgot, but I have the description here, and he says how sad he is to see those posters. That is what is interesting. It is the immediate, the naive, the question of Moshe Flinker, are we near redemption because God has really very Orthodox kid, 16 years old, family, very Orthodox. Are we near redemption for all the sufferings? I mean, our sufferings are well beyond our sins, so there must be a divine plan here that we will be redeemed. And what did he do in his day when he went, because he was living under other identity, he went to see Yud Zeus. So his reaction to the film as a Jew in hiding, incredible, or he was learning Arabic. In order, when he goes to Eretz Israel, you could speak with the Arab neighbors, you see, in hiding in Brussels. And when God doesn't give an answer, he says, maybe we are lost, maybe our sins were really much too much. And then he gives a description of the situation of the Jews, which I think is so shocking and heart-wrenching that only a 16-year-old boy or girl could have written it. He says it's like people dancing. Everybody is dancing and happy in a hall, and then there is only one group which is neither happy nor dancing. And from time to time, he says, people come, take them in the next room and strangle them, he says. And the more they strangle, the more the others are dancing. I mean, this has nothing to do with a view of the situation. This has to do with sheer emotion of that boy, which was killed in Auschwitz, and with the reader. So you see, and very religious, so how he deals with God in this situation is left open, of course, but he believed to the end. So that is what I looked for in the diaries, not at all any documentation about the situation, but also, if I may, only one more second, small details which say a lot about the situation without really being an overview of the situation. What's his name? Ringelblum, in one of his diary entries, says, we have a lot of German tourists coming to visit the ghetto with their cameras, and they come, and what they like most to film, and that's 41, is the morgue, how do you say morgue in English? where the corpses are aligned and piled up during the day, because they will be buried after a few days during the night time. But in the meantime, there is a whole line of those tourists taking pictures of the morgue, and many comments are, well, not at all pity, but the Jews are not dying fast enough. I think there is a little detail which means nothing at all, except that it means a lot for something that no German document can tell you, you see.
Again, first of all, thank you for your very enlightening and interesting lecture. My name is Eva Moraal, and I'm also a PhD student. And I'm also working, well, almost finishing my thesis on Camp Westerbork, and then the experiences on Westerbork, yes, and then the experiences of the inmates as expressed actually in their diaries, letters, and memoirs. And actually, the question I'd like to ask is a bit more general, and it relates to the use of written and unwritten testimonies in the historiography of the persecution. And in a sense, you could say that these sources have always been central, because they were often the only source of information left of what happened. And if I look at Dutch historiography, the early ones, they were actually often used as sort of the backbone of, you could say it was the documentary backbone of early Dutch historiography. Jacques Presser used them extensively, for example. Then if you look at international historiography, for example, Hilberg I'm thinking of now, he actually, didn't use them and shunned them in a way because of their supposed subjectivity. Again, for the last 20 years, though, in general historiography and maybe also specifically the historiography of the persecution, you could see that there's actually it's sort of a revival of the use of these kind of documents, these kind of sources. And I was wondering, what do you think has changed in the use of these testimonies by historians, especially in the history of the persecution, but also maybe in a broader sense? I'm, for example, now thinking of Professor Ginsburg's exploits in the microhistory area. And where would you position yourself in this change?
Well, that's a huge question, and of course, Carlo Ginsburg has used Menacchio's explanation of himself and of the world many, many years ago in a wonderful, super wonderful way. Alltagsgeschichte, I think, demanded a return to the experience of the daily life, and that, of course, was used, but again, you can use it one way or you can use it another. What is, to my mind, more problematic in the use of, you see, in written diaries of those who perished, not diaries, well, Klemperer is an exception, but usually I rejected using many diaries, Hungarian ones, for example, in written, translated then into German, because I sensed immediately this was touched again, or after the war. The mother had survived, famous writer, the daughter was deported in Hungary. But you saw that you needed to read a few pages to see that the mother was mentioning events that the daughter could not have known of. So that's enough, you know, you read those diaries. And there are many like that, which also people who came to Israel and then slightly retouch about the resistance and so on. You leave them out. So you have really mostly diaries of those who perished and who, I would say, didn't have the time to change their diary. Also, if I understand correctly, Anne Frank rewrote parts of the diary when she heard that there would be, after the war, a Dutch kind of prize or something like that. But then again, you say to yourself, well, yes, that already is a problem, and you can analyze what is authentic and what is not. But then Anne Frank was, after all, only 14 or 14, right? When she read. So again, what you have is the naivete, also very sophisticated in her case, yet nonetheless the naivete of a child. And that was, you know, it's enough to make some moments absolutely authentic. If somebody 30 years old had done that, then you would say, well, better not touch that diary. Now, the problem I see today, there is a return to this material, but there is another development which has taken immense proportions, mainly at least in the States, is the oral history.
Yes,
I'm very skeptical of oral history for a reason which has nothing to do with those who speak, but those who interview. Very often they don't know enough to catch the moment when the person speaking is about to say something where the kind of reorganized life will be shattered. You see, in many of those oral testimonies, and there is a wonderful book which overcame some of the, it's by Christopher Browning now, on recaptured memories, or what, which is about a work camp.
Yes.
But the big project in Los Angeles, the Shoah Foundation, Spielberg and so on, 40,000 or what, the interviews, I know them because some of them were my students, and then they were expelled one after the other because they went on asking, they wanted very standardized questionnaires so that you have, actually the person who asks the question gets very organized answers, organized in the mind for many decades. These are, of course, elderly people. And it is true that under the surface you have the raw memory, but you have to touch it. And if you, some projects, in Yad Vashem a little bit, and at Yale, they managed to jolt, or let's say Lanzmann, to jolt the interviewee sufficiently to have him, it's hard to say, to have him break down at some moment and speak, you know, his raw emotions. But that demands a technique of interviewing and interviewing at length and coming back and back, which most of those new big collections of oral testimonies do not. So they say, well, but they give us details. Let's say you look in the electronic index for the little town of XYZ in Romania, in Transylvania. You will have 8 persons speaking about it. You will, well, we can have it other ways as well. So, yes, testimonies, but raw testimonies, non-careful about the diaries and who wrote them when, and of course, problematic use of the oral testimony.